Eminence, Excellencies, most distinguished participants. 25 years into democracy, sometimes it is helpful to try and figure where we are, great natural endowments, where we have been, and indeed where we want to be collectively. Just like in a river, the water that you touch is the last of what has passed, but the first of what is yet to come. We are a country in flux. Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's children. Big potential, big dreams, big hope. But unfortunately, in a serious spot of bother. Mostly because of the choices we have made. South Africa's current challenges have nothing to do with the availability of resources, but everything to do with our inability to manage, to plan, lead, coordinate, and organize. Whilst most countries in the world bemoan the fact that they are at the behest of the economy, of natural forces, all of our challenges are self-made, self-harm, cutting our nose to spite our face. But fortunately, all our problems are well known, well articulated, and so are the solutions, well known and well written about. What has been missing is our ability to do. Execution. It was General George Patton who reminded us that great wars are won by good execution, not by great plans. Because good execution will save even a mediocre plan. Of all the mineral resources that the world needs, this continent has them in abundance, either as number one, at the very least, as number two. And yet, we are the poorest, and indeed, sometimes referred to as the dark continent. Even the sun here shines 222 days in a year. That's why this is God's own country. And yet, there is no doubt that the majority of our people are not reaching their potential. Not their fullest potential, just their potential. Because of the last 9 wasted years, we are now at the precipice, at the crossroads, where the last of the 3 rating agencies, Moody's, will be making a decision soon, especially after they announced another bailout to Eskom, this 4th largest utility in the world. Our single biggest systemic risk, but also our largest contingent liability. Because when Eskom goes down, not only does the economy goes down, but the whole country goes down. So if Moody's were to downgrade us to below investment grade, 100 billion South African rands will flow out of this economy, because those asset managers don't even have the discretion but not to invest in entities and countries that are below investment grade. If that were to happen, there will be a run on the rand. The South African Reserve Bank will be forced to hike rates to protect the currency. The cost of borrowing to government and to more than 700 state-owned entities and state-owned companies will increase. your discretionary purchasing power will be eroded as you'll pay more for your bond and the repayment on your cars. To fully appreciate what we have brought to ourselves, it is sometimes helpful to try and quantify the cost of state capture for posterity's sake, so that we can relate these stories to our children, to ensure that mistakes again. In our back of the cigarette box calculation, as Business Leadership South Africa, representing 86 of the CEOs of large companies, mostly listed on the JSE, 53 of whom are responsible for more than half the national GDP of this country. This organization, founded in 1960, even before I was born. We estimate that just in the last 4 years, we have lost 1.5 trillion South African rands to state capture, just in 4 years, which is 2/3 of what we collect a year every year through the South African Revenue Service, one of the top 5 revenue services in the world. In the 9 wasted years, we estimate that we've been of this economy just to the 2 Zupta families about 100 billion South African rands a year every year. Imagine what we could do with that amount of money. When hashtag everything must fall movement started, that ushered in free fee higher education institutions of higher learning. We estimated that if we were to pay for all 1.2 million students, not just the indigent, where the cutoff was 256,000 combined household income, now increased to 600,000, it would have cost us about 53 billion per annum for all of them. Imagine for a moment how many 5.5-year-olds Michael Komapes and Lumka would be still walking around us, laughing shrieks of absolute joy, rather than dying a sad, tragic, regrettable death in pit toilets 25 years into democracy. 25 years is a long time, and we are no longer called teenagers. Because 25 years, it's more than what it took West Germany to decide to merge with East Germany to form a united but nonetheless prosperous Germany. In 20 years, we spoke about a united and prosperous Germany. 25 years is a long time. Because at the moment when we were in snaking queues on the 27th of April, 1994, to usher in our first democratically elected president, at exactly the same moment, Rwanda was going through the most heinous of genocides. In 90 days, 800,000 people were massacred. And yet in 20 years, Paul Kagame has managed to build an economy where if you are in public buses today, there is free Wi-Fi. Of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are found in Africa because we have a low base. One of them is Rwanda. And yet, we know that our potential is this much, our actual performance that much. And this delta is what has ensured that the majority of South Africans have not yet personally benefited from this economic dividend. When there is more people unemployed than those that are in meaningful jobs. 18 million people of the 57.8 million South Africans on social security, when only 16 million are gainfully employed. 10 million are unemployed using the narrow definition of 27.6%. Exactly the same population of the entire province of Gauteng. Where more than 8 million young people are not in education, employment, or training. Where youth unemployment is north of 56 percentage points. The elements that were present during the Arab Spring are almost double here, now and imminent. Why Alexander has not gone up in flames, we can only give it to the patience of our people. So what could have happened had we just followed the trajectory of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, who inherited a technically bankrupt country in 1994, quadrupled the size of the GDP in just 5 glorious years? So the slope of the curve was upwards and forwards. In just 5 years, handed over seamlessly in a world-class succession planning to Thabo Mbeki, who continued on that trajectory and gave us 43 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth, the highest being December of 2017, when we reached 5.4% GDP growth. 2007, highest GDP growth at 5.4. Since then, it has been a slippery slope downwards, where in the last 10 years, at the very most, our GDP growth has been on average 3.5. The last 9 wasted years, we didn't even touch 2 percentage point growth. The NDP 2030 said we ought to be growing at 5.4 to be able to absorb the 180,000 young graduates that get onto the job market, often with inappropriate skills. So had we continued on that trajectory, not the precipitous drop that we saw on the way to Polokwane in 2007, unemployment will be 16%, not 27.6. 35% on the expanded definition. GDP growth will be 6%, not the 0.8 that we posted last year, revised downwards by both the South African Reserve Bank and the IMF to 0.6%. Would have banked a trillion South African rands. That, to me, is the opportunity cost. What then should be the business's response in leading in these trying times? Because business has a disproportionate voice, disproportionate resources. They employ 13.5 million people when the 3 spheres of government employ 1.3 million. So when business is transformed, South Africa will be transformed. Because business cannot continue to be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. We need to continue to do business by doing good. Because where business does well, society often also does well. In the interest of time, let me, without any degree of granularity, submit the 6 big burning platform things that business ought to be leading on if we are indeed going to realize the South Africa that all of us have been praying for. Number 1, business must lead on land reform, not just expropriation without compensation. Because on land reform, there are 3 burning issues of land restitution, land redistribution, and land development. And sadly, 25 years into democracy, we haven't even completed a land audit, just to be able to understand for ourselves as to which parcels belong to whom and for what good purpose. But also when you reflect on the fact that of the 400 MPs in Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela's cabinet, the one with the least resources and therefore the smallest budget was the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, because we are not focusing on it. 25 years into democracy, the one that up until today does still not have a permanent land judge. How then do we hope to have delivered on this land reform when for the last 9 months we are now involved in fruitless debates about amending the Constitution, when Section 25 is very clear, especially Article 3A. On that 8th line it says, when conditions of fair and equitable have been adequately fulfilled, compensation can be down to zero. That is your zero. Expropriation without compensation. What we are dealing with here is not policy adequacy, but less doing. Because all we had to do, because the act is clear, is to enact the appropriate legislation and then go ahead and do. We just didn't. And this ANC-led government is unlikely to admit that it's our mistake, we didn't. And therefore, that's why they sponsored and agreed with a motion that says, let's amend the Constitution, in spite of the fact that former President Kgalema Motlanthe had just produced a magnificent piece of work about how to deal with this land, and none of those ministers had read it, the same way that they've not read their executive duties as enunciated in Section 195 of our Constitution. Secondly, I think business needs to lead in ensuring that we are transformed. Therefore, business must lead on transformation. Because if we don't deliberately, purposefully, and consciously deal with this, none of us will sleep well at night. When you go to China, the business is run by Chinese people. In India, it's the same. If you go to Japan, even the culture is typically Japanese, except here, where in our boardrooms, you might be mistaken to think that we are an outpost of Europe. "25 years into democracy, 50% is female, and yet their representations in positions of leadership is less than 24%. We pay women 76% of what we pay men for work of equal value. And yet we know that when you put a smartphone in the hands of women, not only does the personal health, nutrition, and education of their own children improve, but of the entire society and the community from which they come. Business also need to lead on getting us out of this fiscal crisis. Because with the advent of the new dawn, President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa wants to do the right thing, but all the money has been stolen by the immediate past regime, because that's what it was. The revelations in the 4 commissions of inquiry don't give a revelation every day, but a bombshell every hour. Business must also lead in ensuring that we retain the few jobs that we have, so that we can create jobs in large numbers, so that the majority of our people can reclaim back their self-worth, their self-respect, self-esteem. There is no glory in waking up in the morning to queue at 4 o'clock to be a recipient of social grants. All of us want the same thing for our children. Business must also lead in ensuring that the GDP of this country, the size of this economy grows. Because if the economy is not growing, very soon we'll be talking about the redistribution of poverty, not the redistribution of wealth. Lastly, business must lead in ensuring that we grow our own timber. The people that work for us can't just be the work of government. Therefore, business must take this notion of education seriously. We are the only country in the whole of Africa, 1.3 billion people, 54 countries that speak 2,000 languages, that became free from our colonial masters, and yet we did not intentionally improve the quality of our education. 1957, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, 10 years into democracy, they were boasting of an 80% literacy rate. Even Gabriel Robert Mugabe, in spite of the 1,001 challenges that country is confronted with, that used to be the breadbasket of the continent, today boasts of a 94% literacy rate. What do we have to boast with? The last FAIRS study, FIRS, says 80% of our grade 4 learners cannot read with comprehension. Somehow we have sent out a strategic narrative that says it's okay to pass with 30%. Education matters. Not because it's the surest way in which one can transcend social classes. Not so much because you can be born in the informal settlement of Alexander, 4 kilometers across the bridge from the richest square mile in the continent. And in 25 years, you can afford a house in the leafy suburbs of Bryanston, not because you want a tender, but because you earned it to deserve it, then you can afford it. Education matters because when one burns the midnight oil, one gains access to the domain of knowledge and wisdom, the world of meaning, the world that cannot be conquered without a persistent crusade.